think about the Mary Poppins story? I wonder. Hello, welcome to the Chrissy Grace Scarlet Pen YouTube channel. I am an author, creativity chaser, and book lover. I'm also a little bit of a kook, if you couldn't tell. Sometimes I can be quite quirky, and as such, I have Mary Poppins' umbrella right with me today. And the reason is, yes, that's the reason, you guessed it, because I'm doing another book versus movie review. I wanted to know what the differences were, the main differences between the film Mary Poppins and the book itself by P.L. Travers. I got my little umbrella here. I didn't buy this for the sake of this video. I actually already own this umbrella. So, I read Mary Poppins because I watched the movie when I was a kid, all the time. Disney, Julie Andrews, I mean, come on. And like Dick Van Dyke, all of the great people. And I had this book, but I'd never actually read it. I did keep it though. Let's talk about the differences. Okay, so I will tell you which one is my favorite, the book or the movie. But first, I have to let you know what the main differences were. There were some glaring differences to the book and the movie. As far as I know, there's actually multiple books. And so when I reference things like this wasn't in the movie or this wasn't in the book and things like that, I'm talking about just this first book, Mary Poppins, and I am only talking about the film from Disney with Julie Andrews and Dick Van Dyke, not any other sort of adaptations and things like that. So those are the things that I'm referencing. I am aware that potentially there are extra scenes that were in the movie that maybe are in the books or maybe not. I'm not sure because I've only read the one, but that's what I'm referring to. So let's go. The character of Mary Poppins I will talk about first because poor Mary, well, not poor Mary, the character of Mary Poppins in the book versus the movie is real different. Julie Andrews is really likable. She's really, like, she still has a firm, proper presence about her, but she's also really likable. And in the very, like, one of the very first scenes when we meet Mary, she's reading off the children. They had what they wanted in a nanny. And it was things like, you know, don't get cross at us and things like that. And, you know, cheery disposition and all the rest. So her character was really quite likable, even though she was firm and a bit proper at times and, you know, oh, such a scene. She still had this really nice, likable quality about her. In the book, however, Mary Poppins was not a nice person. She was rude. She was very, very vain. Very vain. She was snapping and cross all the time. She was really not a nice person. She brought the magic and these amazing experiences with her still, but she wasn't a nice person at all, particularly not to the kids, Jane and Michael. I don't think that if they didn't do the movie and I'd only read the book and that was the only experience, I wouldn't have liked Mary Poppins. I would have thought she was an awful, selfish, vain, terrible person who I don't really see what she did that made people like her so much or want her to stay so much apart from the magical adventures that she took the kids on. So I hated the Mary Poppins of the book, but I loved the Mary Poppins of the movie. That was a huge personality difference. Another thing in regards to the characters was Bert. In the movie, Dick Van Dyke did a fabulous job being Bert, and I love his character. He's so much fun. In the book, he is only in one very small part of the book, and the rest he's just not in it at all. So, in the book, Bert was a matchbook seller or a match seller, like, you know, you light a match for a cigarette. And he did draw the paintings on the sidewalk, and Mary Poppins went to him and to go into the picture with him by herself. She didn't go with the kids. They didn't go on this grand adventure, all four of them. It was literally just Mary Poppins on her day out, seeing Bert, the match seller, and they happened to go on this adventure inside the picture by themselves. I much preferred the scene in the movie where the kids got to go on that fabulous adventure, and it wasn't just Mary Poppins and Bert by themselves. What the heck was the point of that scene if it wasn't anything to do with these kids? Like, it was just Mary Poppins by herself on her day out, hanging out with a guy and going into a picture with chalk. Like, with the kids, it gave it this really nice, fun element. Although, having said that, which will lead me into my part of my next point, was there was a lot that happened in that picture in the movie that didn't happen in the book at all. So there was no merry-go-round a derby where they won, and there was fox chase, and that side of that just didn't happen in the book. There were some elements that got added, and one of which is all of Bert's scenes except for that one bit. He was added into every scene. So the laughing with Uncle Albert didn't have Bert in it in the book, but it did in the movie, which I thought was really great anyway, because Bert added an extra level of this I love to laugh. That was one of my favourite scenes in the film, I just have to say. Laughter can be so contagious, and that was one of my favourite scenes. But in the book, Bert wasn't there. Also in the book was nothing to do with chimney sweeps. There was no chimney sweeps in the book at all. And yet, there was a whole big giant scene with chimney sweeps towards the end with Bert in the film, and it was so good, and it was really fun. Literally nothing about chimney sweeps, not even a little mention in the Mary Poppins book. I couldn't say for the follow-ups. And one of those was also with a lot of the stuff with Mr. Banks going to the bank and the whole bank situation. So none of that was in the book. There was nothing about the parents really at all. The mother had almost no role at all in the movie. They gave her the suffragette stuff, which was a really fun thing to add to her character, and also the actual character of Mr. Banks. The two parents in the book were barely there. The book really was about Mary Poppins and the kids, and so this movie added them a little bit more into the story. And if you've seen the movie Saving Mr. Banks with Tom Hanks in it, that was sort of, I think that explained a little bit more as to why there was a positive spin at the end with the dad and the kites and whatever, and more of the dad in there. But as far as the book goes, Mr. Banks and Mrs. Banks were barely in it, and there was no scene with the kids going to the bank, with the dad potentially getting fired or getting let go or whatever. None of that was in the book at all. But what was in the book was so many more adventures and magical adventures that Mary Poppins took these kids on that just didn't make it into the movie. There was something about, there was a story with a cow and dancing. There was, there were characters in the very beginning. If you've read the book, it was such an interesting thing to hear. At the very beginning, Bert is doing his one-man band routine, and he sings to a couple of different people, like, Mrs. Crowley, your daughters were shorter than you, but they grew. And so the characters in that song actually were characters in the stories that didn't make it into the movie. So we saw Mrs. Lark with Andrew in the park. There was a whole story about Andrew the dog and Mrs. Lark. There was a story about, the old woman, her daughters who grew, which was different. But they were actually magical adventures that were taken, and they didn't show up in the film. And some of those were pretty amazing, and I think would have been really cool in the movie. Something I also noticed was the definitely obvious green screens. You could tell they were obvious green screens. Like, there's outlines, limited by the technology of the time. Another really big obvious difference was in the book there were 4 kids in the Banks family, 2 of whom were babies and got their own chapter, their own story. But in the movie they only stuck with Jane and Michael. I understand why they did that. It would have just been easier with just the Jane and Michael characters and not having to deal with this baby situation. So I do understand why that was done, but that was a big difference. And there was also absolutely no mention of kites. I don't know where this Let's Go Fly a Kite came from. I haven't seen Saving Mr. Banks for a while because it honestly wasn't my favourite movie. But I don't know where this idea of kites came from. But so that also was not in the book as well. There were substantial differences, but I feel like the main essence of the book was kept for the movie. There were lots of things that linked in and I just thought was hysterical. There was one giant scene with a zoo situation, and even though in the movie there wasn't, they mentioned the zoo. The kids ran off, "Are they at the zoo?" Because in the story the kids ran to go to the zoo. That was kind of cool. I understand time-wise and story-wise why things were left out. Of course they were, but the main essence of the book and of the story, I think, was kept. The only main essence that I think wasn't kept was Mary Poppins herself. Again, book, she was rude and always cross, and she sniffed "I'm better than you" a lot in this book, a lot. She was not a nice individual, and yet Julie Andrews did a great job with the Mary Poppins in the film to make her more endearing, and yes, she was still proper and a little firm when she needed to be. She had a lot more patience, I think, even though it doesn't seem like it necessarily if you've only seen the film, but if you've read the book, she had a lot more patience than the book version of Mary Poppins. Yeah. I think for me, the book and the movie had really great elements that were really different and separate. Like I said, lots of scenes were added and lots were taken away from the books that wasn't in the film. So I think that they both had great elements that the other didn't have. However, if I had to say what my favorite was, it would be the film, predominantly because the character of Mary Poppins sucked in the book. And again, if I hadn't watched the film, I would hate the character of Mary Poppins. I think she's a stuck-up, snob, vain, self-absorbed. She's always looking in like windows and mirrors to see how she looks and see how pretty she looks in her things, and I just hated that, and I think she was an awful character. I don't understand where someone saw a positive character in that to make the film, but I am glad they did, because the only reason that I like the character of Mary Poppins is the film. So overall, the film won it out for me, not the book. Which is really a shame because, you know, it had a lot of promise. And there was a lot of there was things in the book I did like. I didn't just dislike the book altogether. Did I inspire you to go and watch Mary Poppins? My little umbrella and me. If you liked my book versus movie review, hit the like button and subscribe to my channel, and I will continue to make more of these. There are some really surprising things that were books first that I certainly didn't realize was turned into a movie from a book. My parrot and I are going to now move on to the next book, book versus movie book. So if you know any movies that were based off of a book, let me know, because I want to grow my list. I don't want to just stick to the ones that I know of. I want to know more. Otherwise, thanks guys for watching. I'll see you in the adventures.